Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada seminar series. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Becky Schaumberg, who's going to be talking to us about shame and getting fooled, which should be fun. And we're joined here by 5 great panelists: Jeff Goodwin, Jessica Kennedy, Sam Skowronek, Eric Van Epps, and Jeremy Ip, as well as Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson. For all of you who have never done this before, you'll see that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions that will be seen by all of us, including Becky, but she's going to be busy talking, but don't worry, we will try to read them, and when possible, we will interrupt her and ask questions. So basically, and even if we don't get to your questions, it all gets logged and we'll share them with her after the fact. So those are the basics. Beyond that, the floor is yours, Becky. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you so much. Before I begin, I just really want to extend my gratitude to the panelists for being here and giving your time to this. All of your work on emotions, what we can learn from them, on moral character, how we think about it, also the stereotypes we have about individuals based on moral character, and how we encourage sort of pro-social behaviors really inspired my own thinking. So I'm really grateful for you to be here. I also really want to acknowledge my fantastic collaborator on this, which is Sam Skowronek, and he'll be here to help answer questions as well. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about shame, and it might be a bit weird to talk about shame because it is something that we often do not do. This is because in modern Western societies like the United States, we are socialized not to display shame or to talk about it. This is because shame is often associated with subordinated status and social devaluation. Indeed, the very experience of shame is so taboo that it can lead people to feel shame about the very fact that they feel ashamed. Shame is a negative self-conscious emotion. It is an aversive feeling related to a negative judgment about the core self. Shame is considered a self-conscious emotion because it requires self-awareness and self-reflection. It requires the ability to judge the self from the viewpoint of others. And now, while shame is inherently a social emotion, its experience is not constrained to social situations. Indeed, we can feel shame when we just merely think that others may judge us negatively. And so while shame is sometimes hidden from view, it has a profound effect on our behavior. And the notion that shame has this profound sort of influence on our behavior has deep historical roots. However, whether shame shapes our behavior in profoundly good or bad ways is, for lack of a better word, debated. The debate is something kind of like this. So we think about functional theories of shame, deriving from sort of functional theories of emotion. From this viewpoint, shame has really been considered a moral emotion. It is thought that shame acts as an internal constraint that regulates individuals' behaviors in line with collective standards of appropriate behavior, and then can facilitate coordination and cooperation. However, in contrast to this view, work stemming from what I'm going to call the affective styles approach or the attributional approach to the study of shame suggests that shame is not a moral emotion, but actually quite an ugly emotion. And this is because of the long list of maladaptive correlates of the shame experience. Indeed, people who tend to experience high levels of shame, it tends to be correlated with high levels of anger, externalization of blame, hostility, and even deviance. And so noting these sort of 2 different perspectives about the morality of shame, we sort of have a bit of a puzzle. On the one hand, we have some conclusions suggesting there's virtually no function, moral function of shame, and others suggesting quite the opposite. So when we think about this puzzle, there's been other work that has attempted to solve this puzzle or reconcile these 2 different perspectives. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but just some ways that people have thought about this puzzle and ways to reconcile it. But what sort of all of these different perspectives share in common is that they focus on the effect of shame for the person who experiences it. to try and figure out whether shame is functional for me as the person who experiences this emotion. So you think most of it, we want to say, so you're experiencing shame, and is this experience of shame functional for you, or is it maladaptive for you? Well, we take the perspective that any conclusion about the moral nature of shame or lack thereof needs to zoom out beyond the individual who experiences it to look at how shame affects the broader collective or the inter-individual consequences of shame. So that is, how does your experience of shame regulate my behavior? And through this sort of social learning effect, which is, does your experience of shame facilitate my learning of social norms and regulate my behavior? Answering that question will help us to get purchase on the function of shame within a collective. To bring this a little bit to life, so you can imagine, we're going to say, so imagine here, I'm going to say this is Erin, and Erin is working on a presentation, and during the presentation, she realizes that she has made a mistake in her calculations that has harmed her colleagues. And in response to realizing this, Erin feels a high level of shame. And here we often say this experience of feeling shame can be very costly for Erin in that experience. But what we want to know is, how does her experience of shame in response to this behavior affect these other individuals who may witness or be exposed to her shame experience? And so when we start to take this social effect, or the social learning effect of shame, and start to look at the inter-individual effects of an individual's experience of shame, what do we see? We think that there's an interesting possibility, and this is a lot of words though, that we can learn what is appropriate or inappropriate and adjust our behavior accordingly when we see someone experience shame, without ourselves having to endure the pain of social devaluation and other costs that come from the shame experience. So overall, in thinking about this inter-individual or social learning effect of shame on norm acquisition and conformity, I'm going to suggest that your experience of shame helps me to learn injunctive norms. So what is socially or morally appropriate in a group? And then after learning that norm, I'm going to be able to regulate my behavior to align with those norms, presumably to avoid the experience of shame that you have endured.
Becky?
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Which parts of this are specific to shame, as opposed to if I see someone experiencing regret or sadness or and so on, do I also learn the norms from that as well? Or is shame unique in this way?
So one of the questions, right, is the relative, if we want to think about how strong does a signal of shame regulate someone's behavior compared to another discrete emotional experience, be it embarrassment, be it anger, be it sadness, what we're going to do is we will be able to compare shame to anger and show that there is a strong effect of showing negative emotion in terms of how I can learn social norms. And we're going to compare the experience of shame to the experience of anger to show that shame, at least relative to anger, has a stronger sort of conduit of information about social norms. When it comes to other discrete emotional experiences, such as sadness, we won't compare directly to sadness. And I think it's a very interesting question to go forward, to not just say whether shame carries this social function, but which of the various emotions are most important for carrying that information. And I also just want to say to that is that when we think about how do people think and see an experience, so oftentimes when people display shame, it's encoded in sadness, particularly in Western contexts where we don't often use the term shame. So one of the other things that we've been trying to work on is how to really be able to communicate clearly that someone is experiencing shame and not, for instance, experiencing embarrassment, regret, guilt, or sadness. So overall, generating a couple of predictions. So we're going to predict that on average, people are going to perceive stronger injunctive norms against a behavior when a target expresses shame in response to that behavior than when they express a neutral emotion or anger, which will be our discrete emotion that we will compare shame against. We're going to look at descriptive norms. So we want to predict that people perceive stronger descriptive norms, that a behavior is less common when a target expresses shame in response to that behavior than when they experience anger or express a neutral emotion. And finally, we're going to try to look at behavior regulation, those inter-individual behavior regulation. So people report less willingness to engage in a behavior that someone expresses shame in response to compared to a neutral emotion or anger. And perhaps more importantly, we're going to show that, at least when it comes to comparing to neutral behavior, we're going to look at actual behavior. So we're going to compare whether we can actually regulate individuals' behavior when they witness somebody else's shame experience.
Becky, can I interrupt for a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, when you were giving the introduction, I thought where you were going with this was entering into this debate over whether shame has positive or negative effects on people's behavior, which I had largely made sense out of by thinking about shame as creating avoidance. And when we think about moral behavior, you know, of course, it's complicated because sometimes to do right by people, we want to, you know, not do bad things to them. Sometimes we need to do good things. And so I kind of had this picture in my head. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but now you're coming in with this social perspective, and I'm trying to understand, like, why is it important to look at the social consequences of shame more so than the effects on the person's behavior who is experiencing it?
No, thanks for the question. And I think in terms of relative importance, I think obviously if we want to know sort of the role, the function that shame has in a collective, we need to know both of those sides, which is it could very well be that shame, the experience of shame has a great cost to an individual, spurring things like avoidance and withdrawal and externalization of blame, while also potentially effectively regulating other people's behavior who sees it. I would say the majority of work that has looked at the effects of shame have focused on the individual's behavior. And I said they're going to have these kind of mixed conclusions about it. And so one of the things that we really want to do is to say, if we want to sort of understand how shame functions in the collective, that it's this social aspect that feels relatively underappreciated compared to trying to predict individuals' behavior. But Jessica, you're absolutely right that one of the things that can make the shame experience kind of devastating for the individual experiences it in terms of their own behavior, that intra-individual effect, is through avoidance and withdrawal. Indeed, if you can sort of hold constant people's avoidance or withdrawal tendency, you can sometimes see some positive effects in terms of conformity to behavior on people's anticipation of shame. So it really does feel like it's that withdrawal, avoidance, hiding impulse that can carry some of the negative weight on individuals' behavior. So keeping with sort of the social function of shame, study 1A and study 1B are going to be highly similar. I'll focus on describing study 1A, which we're going to just look at sort of establishing how shame communicates critical information about social norms. Study 2, we're going to try to look at incentivized behavior to see whether shame actually regulates and changes people's behavior when there's incentive or financial consequences. And then finally, if there is time or there is interest, can look at sort of shame versus shaming, which we'll talk about sort of expressing shame versus being shamed, and the sort of similar information that they share, that they send about social norms. And then I don't think we'll get this, but actually was going to address sort of Jessica's point about being able to distinguish between the shame experience and withdrawal or avoidance. A couple of features of the studies that I would like to highlight. The first is, in every study, we're going to look at behaviors that are not inherently morally valenced. And the reason for that is because we are interested in norm acquisition. So how someone's shame and responsive behavior can communicate that a norm might be moral. And so this way, we're not going to use any behavior that people would come into inherently probably think that that was a either right or wrong way to behave. We are going to communicate shame through nonverbal expressions in order to circumvent sometimes the different construals people might have about what shame means. However, we are not inherently, I would say, focused on nonverbal expressions, even though there's a really wonderful, robust literature on nonverbal expressions and how people recognize them. And finally, this actually goes back to Lisa's original question. We're going to focus on testing the social effects of shame. Again, we'll compare it to anger, but we won't be able to answer a lot of questions about sort of how well shame compares to all of the other discrete emotional experiences people could have in terms of communicating norms. And then the final thing I just want to note about the studies is that they should probably feel relatively intuitive. These findings are relatively robust, and the idea that we can learn information from other people's shame experiences is something I think that probably should feel true. Our goal is just trying to call attention to the social learning effects of shame so that we can broaden and clarify our understanding of the function of shame within the collective experience. So I said, there's study 1A and study 1B. They have a very similar design. I am going to walk through study 1A and then go through the results and then briefly talk about the slight differences in study 1B and then compare the results across the two studies. So the flow of studies 1A and B, participants are going to read about a workplace behavior. They're going to then see a target's emotional response to that behavior. And then they're going to answer questions about the organizational norms or the norms they perceive in this organization. So all participants came in and they were asked to sort of imagine this scenario. So imagine Michael works for the company Abbott Consulting. Michael is committed to Abbott Consulting and enjoys working at Abbott Consulting. Michael strives to stay at Abbott Consulting and eventually move up at Abbott Consulting. Just as a note, everything in red was stimuli sampled. So all names and the companies were stimuli sampled and randomized across participants. In terms of study design, they were then told below are pictures, so as you see the stimuli sampling of Christopher and various emotions that Christopher could experience. As a note, we use shame here in the introduction happiness here in the introduction to sort of take attention away from the negative emotions that we're studying, but no participant ever saw Christopher or this target express happiness in response to any behavior. They were then told that last week, Michael did the following at Abbott Consulting. For instance, rejected a supplier's application over email. And this is what I wanted to highlight. This is not inherently a moral or immoral behavior. We just sort of take an innocuous behavior that somebody might have within an organization, and we're going to try to see if we can make it normative by changing an emotional response to it. And we say Michael feels like this, either a neutral emotion, feels shame, or feels anger. And then talking about, we randomly sampled the various behaviors or workplace behaviors that participants saw that Michael engaged in. Participants were randomly assigned either set A or set B, and then a random sample of these behaviors within their set. We set up this design because we wanted to avoid a situation in which we would be sending mixed signals about an organization's culture. For instance, someone seeing shame in response to deferring to a supervisor's judgment in making a decision, and then seeing someone also show shame in response to challenging their supervisor's judgment in a meeting. We measured perceptions of injunctive norms, descriptive norms, and behavioral intentions. And before getting to the results, I just want to clarify an aspect about the design, which is this was a within subjects design. So each participant in the study randomly saw 3 different behaviors and randomly saw an emotion assigned to that behavior, and we randomized the emotions with replacement. So what this would look like if you were a participant in the study, so you have this set up, and you say, last week Michael did the following at Abbott Consulting. For instance, shared his concerns publicly about Abbott Consulting's strategic direction. You could see that Michael had a neutral emotion to that, shame or anger. You would then see a second behavior, so rejected a supplier's application over email. You could also see shame, anger, or a neutral emotion in response to that. And finally, a third, you say share a wild, very out-of-the-box idea during a meeting. Again, you could see shame, anger, and neutral. And so with this design, some participants might have seen Michael, in this case, Michael express shame in response to one of the behaviors, but not the other 2. Could have seen Michael express shame in response to all 3 of the behaviors.
Becky, can I ask a tiny clarifying question?
Yeah.
So you have these images and the labels. Do the participants see both the image of Michael and the label, or both? Or
no, so they only see the picture.
Okay.
So they only see the picture. We assess whether they, after the study, can identify that this is shame and that this is anger. And about 95% of participants can accurately identify the emotion that is being expressed here. Okay. But we do not give them these notes. I gave those notes as a slight tool to clarify.
It's helpful, thanks.
Yeah.
Becky, I just wanted to pull out a question from the chat window, which is why the choice of anger as the comparison emotion?
So the choice of anger was, so anger, sort of righteous anger, can also sometimes communicate moral information, and it's something that I felt like participants could distinguish between seeing the expression of shame. I think the closest thing that you would see with shame would be sadness, but I find that sadness and shame, at least in terms of communicating them non-verbally, are a bit hard to distinguish.
Becky, what if you chose happiness? Like, would that provide a similar signaling function?
So I think it's interesting when you think about the communicating the opposite. So we're looking at here like whether a behavior is prescriptive, so something you should not do, whereas a positive behavior could signal that an emotion is prescriptive or a behavior that you should do. And I would say in addition to happiness, the positive corollary of shame is often pride. And my sense is there's another way, this is kind of building off of Jessica Tracy's work, that we can learn probably positive information about norms by also seeing an individual express pride in response to a particular behavior.
One other element of the design I wanted to ask about, you have this bit that other people learn about this action. How important, or how should I think about the importance of like other people viewing or knowing about this action rather than me just feeling shame or anger in kind of a vacuum?
Yeah, so I think, Eric, thanks for calling out, because that was a deliberate, like in trying to think about where I would expect these effects to be the strongest, or shame is going to be the strongest when there's some sense of social devaluation or fear of social devaluation. So other people know about it. So if you imagine like nobody learns anything about this reaction, but Michael feels this emotion privately, would that still communicate that it is a normatively inappropriate behavior to do? My guess is yes, compared to not feeling shame, but it's possible that when you also say that it's private, that individuals would be more inclined to make an internal attribution that this is Michael's own evaluation about whether that behavior is appropriate or inappropriate. But you can say it was a deliberate design, and that's exactly the context where I'd expect it. And it was like when other people would know about it, and partly because shame has been associated a bit with public exposure. Something that would be nice to do going on is to sort of manipulate whether this is something that nobody learned about, but that you feel about it solely in private. And then so just looking at the results, so this is going to be plotting injunctive norms, so norms against a behavior, descriptive norms, how uncommon the behavior is you think it is at this company, and then your likelihood if you were somebody at that company to engage in the behavior. And basically what you can see here is that, yes, this is going back to Lee's question, expressing a negative emotion in response to a behavior sends a strong signal that it is more inappropriate than sending a neutral emotion. So the stars here are just going to reflect the comparison between expressing anger and expressing shame. So on average, people see it as there's very stronger prescriptions against a behavior when people express shame than when they express anger. We see a similar but a weaker effect when it comes to descriptive norms. And then people are less likely to engage in a behavior when individuals express shame in response to it than when individuals express anger. But of course, expressing negative emotions in response to the behavior sends the signal about that people would like to avoid that emotional experience associated with engaging in that behavior. And then I just want to, so the study 1B was a pre-registered replication of study 1A with a couple just small differences I'm just going to highlight very quickly. One is we just wanted to see whether the results generalize across the gender of the target expressing the emotion. And here I want to note that we actually did not make any predictions that the gender of the target should moderate the effects. So this is purely to see that it generalizes across stimuli. And then we changed the way that we ask the questions. We just shortened the way we ask the questions a bit. And then the final other design difference was rather than having this participants see 3 behaviors with where they could see, for instance, Michael expressed shame to all behaviors. In this case, participants saw 1 or 2 behaviors. They were randomly assigned for every behavior in random order to either express a neutral emotion, again, a negative emotion of shame versus anger. So in this case, if participants got help from a colleague and then saw that Michael saw neutral, if all of a sudden that we went to say negotiate contract terms with the supplier, they would be randomly assigned either to see shame or to see anger.
Becky, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Super interesting work. What I find interesting about this, so in your first study, I mean, I like the idea that you're contrasting shame with another negative valence emotion, just to demonstrate that people are making those inferences of injunctive norms. But when I think about anger, I mean, it's very much an other focused emotion, right? Like, and so here in the stimuli that you're presenting, it's as if Michael is engaging in a certain behavior, and then he's expressing anger, and a lot of times anger tends to be appraised about what somebody else did rather than himself. And I almost wonder if you had chosen another negative valence emotion, like, I mean, I guess the, you know, one that involves evaluating the self would be guilt, or if you considered maybe anxiety, do you think that we would still find similar pattern of results?
So it's interesting. So the issue, which obviously we see that shame is most often compared to with guilt. One of the challenges with communicating guilt is there's not a recognized nonverbal signal of guilt. So guilt tends to be a fairly private emotion. I think that if you use it verbally and said that an individual experienced guilt in response to something or experienced shame in response to something, right, and use those exact labels, that people would, my guess is, infer very similar responses from guilt and shame, in part because lay people often use those two things interchangeably. It would be interesting if you can really distinguish it, right? We know that sort of shame and guilt sort of associate oftentimes with violating a moral standard or doing something that harmed others, whereas, and I'm drawing here on some of Sam's work on embarrassment, can be a bit more about exposure or like a social faux pas, but might not have that same level of moral connotation. And so I think our goal would be if we could really distinguish how to communicate these discrete emotional experiences, then I think you're absolutely right. Comparing it to an emotion other than anger would allow for a cleaner test of whether shame is better than other emotions at communicating the injunctive norms or descriptive norms of a group.
Like, just to clarify another aspect, sorry if you already said this, but they just get the emotion picture. They don't get the verbal label and the picture, right?
That's exactly right. And thank you. I really should have taken this away. They only see they don't see the sticky note. Okay.
And do you know how reliably they infer the emotion you're trying to convey?
Yeah, very great question. So there, in this study, we had 339 participants and 6 people misidentified the emotion. Now, that said, we don't ask them at the end to identify that emotion out of nowhere. We give them a multiple choice to say, what is the emotion that this person's experiencing? So we limit the various options. We use these stimuli in part because they had been validated through the UC Davis sort of emotional stimuli as to show that they were validated stimuli in terms of people's ability to recognize them being either shame, anger, or neutral emotions, and also have gender as showing the same actor showing these different emotional experiences. Because that's actually one of the challenges, is to get stimuli where you have the same actor showing each of these discrete emotional experiences. And then I'm just going to go through relatively quickly, but so this is just showing the results from study 1A. And then just to show that even though with these different changes to the design and the different changes to the design, as well as sort of across the gender of the target, we see relatively similar results across the 2 different studies. But I really do want to continue. This is something that, again, is going back to Leif's original question, which is the study design of study 2, study 1B, is going to allow us to say, right, we can see these conditional differences, like does shame compared to anger send a stronger information about injunctive norms? But is this simple effect comparing neutral to anger significantly different, or is it moderated rate compared to this simple effect? And so we run a linear mixed model to test whether there is a significant interaction there by the type of negative emotion you received compared to the neutral emotion. And we don't see a significant interaction there, suggesting that overall, right, if we want to think about that, like negative emotions are sending a strong signal of these norms. If we compare within the emotion, shame sends a stronger signal than anger, but if we compare the slope compared to neutral emotion, we don't see that is significantly different. And then so just clarifying, so people perceive stronger norms against behavior when a target expresses shame in response to it than when the target expresses a neutral emotion or anger. We see weaker effects when it comes to descriptive norms, and that individuals express less intention to engage in a behavior when a target expresses shame in response to it than when they express a neutral emotion or anger. But really what we wanted to do next was to really look at actual behavior and to see whether when a target expresses shame in response to that behavior, people will be less likely to engage in that behavior. And so that's going to be the focus of study 2. And now study 2 is a little odd, but every choice we made in it was deliberate. So I'm going to try to walk through each of the different choices that we made. And here, and I think this is a big question, is that we really should be comparing this to other discrete negative emotional experiences, but here we're only going to compare shame compared to a neutral expression. So what we first did is we wanted to create new video stimuli for the shame experience. We wanted also a behavior in which there really was no norm, so no ground truth, and then we're going to incentivize behavior choice. So to create the new video stimuli, just to give you an example about what this looks like, we had 4 different actors who recorded themselves either giving a neutral expression or a shame expression. And I think this is going to Jeff's question. We ran a number of pre-tests to see a threshold that individuals were identifying this emotion more frequently as shame than any other negative emotional experience. And I would say this is, we do see in the study like reliable effects of people being able to pick up that this is shame. This expression right here is the most commonly seen, potentially mistaken for sadness. So then, in addition to creating new video stimuli, we also wanted a behavior in which there's no norm. And again, this is where it might seem a little bit odd. But what we did to say, what would be something where there really is no valence of it being right or wrong? We used illusions. So the choice here that people are going to see is they're going to see a target express an emotion in response to either saying that these ovals are the same color, which color do you see, blue or red? Again, there's no right answer here. There's no ground truth. And so we're going to see if we can get people to change their behavior. For instance, if their target shows shame in response to choosing blue, will our participants then choose red? This will make more sense in a second. And then finally, we're going to incentivize behavior. This is not a strong incentive, and I just want to concede that. So when we actually see their choice, we're going to incentivize them to choose blue. So they're going to get a bonus of 19 cents if they choose blue, and they're going to get a bonus of 15 cents if they choose red. So it is not a large incentive. It's a 4 cents difference, but we're going to see if we can still change people's behavior to encourage them to take a financial cost when they believe doing so would have allowed them to avoid an experience of shame. So participants in this study, we tried to get them to have a feeling of a sense that they were part of a group, which is a bit odd because this is all going to take place online. These are all with prolific academic participants. So they were told they were going to be participating in an asynchronous group decision-making task. They learned they were going to watch group members make decisions. And as a group member, they're going to try to make sense of these decisions and the experiences in the group. And we told them, like, for this reason, the instructions are vague. The group has 4 members. They're going to be joining as the new group member 4. They're going to spend one round of practice round. They're going to shadow this group member 4. And this was random. We had 4 different targets here. And they're going to say, we're going to shadow him in each round or her. You will get to see the decisions that he or she made in each round. There was 2 rounds, a practice round and then the target round. And you will log your decision with the group decision making after each task round. And we give a lot of very vague information about, like, could your behavior affect other people or just affect yourself? So decisions in the group may be evaluated favorably or unfavorably. Your decisions may benefit or harm other people. Your decisions are incentivized. You will earn a bonus. The amount of the bonus will be determined by your individual decisions. Overall, your decisions could affect you or could affect other group members. The group will not know you, but they'll know your decisions. The instructions were relatively vague. And then you can sort of walk throughs, but this is what participants saw. So we used everything. We used a video recording to manipulate everything. So again, they've gone through a practice round. It's the second round. So here they're going to be shadowing her. They learned that this person, this group member 4, saw that decision-making task, and that everybody in the group was going to answer that question. They're going to imagine they're watching group member 4 make this choice. So this is supposedly group member 4 making her choice. And she selects blue, and the target always selected blue. And then we said that, you know, she saw her own decision, after the decisions were revealed to the group. Does she experience shame in response to this blue, or does she experience a neutral emotion in response to this blue? And again, participants only saw one of these two conditions, but this is the full manipulation. And then participants were asked various questions about what just had happened. So we asked them questions about whether it's more acceptable or unacceptable to select blue or red. Here, we're going to say an injunctive norm is that we are trying to say that selecting red, the foregone choice, the thing that the group member did not choose, is that the more appropriate choice compared to selecting blue, which was the group member's choice, the group member 4's choice. The audience ask you questions about descriptive norms. So what do you think the other group members chose? Do you think they selected blue or red? We're going to take the count of red as that choice being more descriptive. So this is the choice that was foregone by group member 4. And then finally, they asked, again, the bonus amounts associated with choices group member 4 are listed below. Whether or how this decision affects the other group members is not shown. You know, do you want to select blue, which comes with a bonus of 19 cents? Or do you want to select red, which comes with a bonus of 15 cents? And so what we're going to see is we want to suggest that when individuals express shame in response to selecting blue, that's going to encourage more individuals to make the financially costly decision of selecting red, presumably so they avoid the experience of shame. And so here we're going to look at this is just the percentage of individuals selecting either red or blue. So in the neutral condition, so when the target expressed basically nothing or a neutral emotion in response to their choice, most participants chose the 19 cents bonus or selected blue because it came with a higher bonus. There were about 10% of participants who selected red, which was in this case came with the cost or a 4 cents cost, so 15 cents. And now here shame is when the target expressed shame in response to their choice. And there we see again about 70% of individuals still chose blue, even though the target expressed shame in response to it for a bonus of 19 cents. But here about 30% of individuals chose the bonus of 15 cents with a financial cost of 4 cents when the target expressed shame in response to choosing blue. So this is a bit confusing, but I can basically say here that there's some people who will be willing to avoid the potential experience of shame for 4 cents. And so again, the financial incentive here is not great, but what we want to do is try to capture people's actual behavior. And so when I see somebody express shame in response to a behavior, I'm willing to take a financial cost or a financial hit, even if it's very, very small, in order to potentially avoid that shameful thing. Again, we asked participants about how acceptable or unacceptable it was to choose red or blue. When the target expressed a neutral emotion in response to this choice, most people are like, it doesn't matter. It's similarly acceptable, the modal choice to choose red or blue. When, of course, the individual expressed shame, people think that it is more acceptable to choose the choice that the foregone choice of the target. So the target chose blue, which was seen as less acceptable than the choice that they did not choose when they expressed shame in response to their choice. We see similar patterns when you ask about whether it's wrong or inappropriate. So people see that when the target, of course, expresses shame, they see the behavior as more inappropriate, which is to choose blue. They also, when the target doesn't express any emotion in response to the behavior, people really don't know sort of what is descriptively normative, like how many different people chose the red option. And then finally, though, when the target expressed shame, most people believe that the other group members chose red, which was the choice that the target group member did not make.
Becky,
and then when we look at the...
Sorry, could I just ask a question here?
Yeah.
I want to ask you how strongly you want to claim that there's sort of genuinely normative content being inferred here. I guess my reaction when I saw the video of the person expressing shame in response to the error is it does seem like there's some sort of self-recrimination going on, some sort of regret, but it's very hard to, at least for me, to interpret what the meaning of that is. It seems a very strong inference to say that they're feeling shameful about it. I guess my thought would be maybe there's some hidden set of incentives that we don't know about, which is why they have regret about that choice. And so when in those questions that you ask about how acceptable or how wrong or and whatnot it might be, I mean, they're not actually committing to, I think now that this is morally wrong or normatively wrong. You could interpret wrong as just incorrect given the rules of the game. So, you know, I think, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, do you think there's genuinely normative content being inferred here as opposed to some other sort of form of recrimination, I guess?
So I think that I want to pick up on something that you said, which is actually how we were kind of thinking about this, which was like, are people trying to infer, like thinking about this as, we thought this kind of like as a hidden collective action problem, which is like, do you defect or do you not defect? Now, we don't say anything about whether there is a benefit to the group or not, or about what your choices are. But what we think is that when individuals show shame, they see that as potentially the more self-interest behavior, or the thing that was non-normative to the group, particularly that the other group members are going to choose the other option. And so whether you want to say it's, we want to say that it's not, it would not be appropriate. Just to wrap this up, so when we look at the relationship between injunctive norms, which was the more appropriate or acceptable option, and descriptive norms, both injunctive norms and descriptive norms relate positively, predict choosing red over blue, predicting the whether people chose what the group member chose or what the group member did not choose. And then finally, in terms of choosing, in terms of sort of a mediation, when we put both as perceptions of injunctive norms and descriptive norms, the effective condition of showing a neutral emotion or shame becomes non-significant. So we see an indirect effect both through perceptions of descriptive norms in this group. Is it normative to choose red as opposed to blue? As well as injunctive norms, do we think it's more acceptable to choose red versus blue? And so this, what we believe that this study can help to demonstrate is that people are less likely to engage in a behavior, even sort of behavior that they don't totally fully understand, when an individual expresses shame in response to that behavior than when the target expresses a neutral emotion in response to that behavior. And then the one thing I want to talk about is like, so one thing we've shown is that shame conveys, can convey norms about what is inappropriate or appropriate to do. We also know that shaming individuals, so some like Jessica's work about accusations or moral outrage, can also convey what is appropriate or inappropriate to do in a collective or in a group. And so we want to know is if someone expresses shame in response to a behavior, do we learn any more about norms when we also see this person express shame in response to that behavior? So what we're going to do in the next study is we're going to manipulate whether people express shame or do not express shame. And then we're going to manipulate whether they are strongly shamed by another person or whether they're weakly shamed by another person. And we're going to measure perceived injunctive norms against the behavior. And here we're trying to say, like, does showing shame convey similar information as does being shamed by other people? And so we similarly use video stimuli in order to be able to manipulate whether people showed shame or whether people were shamed for a behavior. And this is a 2x2 design. So we're going to manipulate whether people showed shame or were shamed, and then whether people expressed shame or did not express shame in response to a workplace behavior. And here what we did is we had people watch what we said was a fictitious Zoom meeting to manipulate shaming and feelings of shame. The stimuli are going to look similar to what we have used in previous studies. So when people know that they're watching a recording of a fictitious Zoom meeting, so they see everybody in the meeting. And then this is just to pause here. Participants in this case were either randomly assigned to see Jessica or randomly assigned to see Eric. Again, all names are coincidental in this case, but just to show that we, in this case, again, are trying to show that the effects are not, we're not making any prediction about whether gender of the target would moderate it, but just to show that it generalizes across both. And then they say that during the current meeting, somebody else in this group is going to send a message through the chat about something that Jessica or Eric had done previously. So in this case, the behavior is, I heard you got help with your reports. And they said someone from analytics mentioned it. So we're calling this the low shaming condition. So they're just calling out a behavior, but not really saying much about it in the low shaming condition. Saying this went to everybody in the group meeting. And then in the high shaming condition, this is pretty overt, but how could you do that? It's wrong, unconscionable, because we're shameful to get help with your sales reports. You should be ashamed. So that, of course, is our high shaming condition. And then to manipulate shame, we're going to manipulate how Jessica supposedly responded to seeing this message. So Jessica, in this case, some people might only see that she saw this neutral message, like I heard you got help with your reports, but is expressing neutrality or a shame in response to it. Or of course, they see that shame, which was fully shamed and expresses no emotion in response to it, or expresses shame in response to it. And then we measured perceived injunctive norms against the behavior. So in this case, our behavior is getting help from others to write one sales report. And then we just measure, right, how acceptable or unacceptable at company T is it to get help on your sales reports. Now, again, here shaming should have a strong effect on how people interpret this information. How inappropriate would you get punished or praised for getting help on your sales reports? And what we're going to look at is the shame versus shaming interaction. So here we're going to see perceptions of injunctive norms. So how wrong would it be to get help on your sales reports as a function of whether you were weakly shamed or strongly shamed, and then whether the target showed a neutral emotion or showed shame. And so this should not be surprising given how strong those words are, that when they were publicly shamed by another person, people infer a stronger injunctive norm against that behavior of getting help on one's writing reports. But what I find actually interesting, and I wasn't actually sure if this would come out this way, is that this slope is not significant, which is when the target expressed shame, it was as though they had been shamed. So one way to look at that is the effect of shaming becomes significantly weaker when the target has expressed shame. Another way that I like to think about this, or I've been thinking about it, is that when a target expresses shame, we send no greater information about the injunctive norm by shaming that individual. And so just again, obviously we have a strong main effect of shaming, a strong main effect of being ashamed, and then a strong interaction between those two. And then just very briefly, as a replication of this study, had a study that was identical to the previous study, except for in this case, we had two targets. One thought here was that if you do not show shame when you have been shamed, when there's another person there also not showing shame, would that mute the effect in any way? But in fact, using that sort of same design where we had two targets who always either express neutrality or shame in congruent ways. And in this case, the behavior was challenging others in a previous meeting. We see very similar results, which is that what we see is that when an individual does not show shame, of course, shaming has this strong positive effect on a perceived injunctive norms that a behavior is wrong or inappropriate. In this case, it was challenging someone in a meeting. However, that effect is significantly weaker when that individual expresses shame. And we again see once an individual expresses shame, there's much less information that we get from actually shaming that individual. And then, so just to sort of conclude, I want to end by just sort of acknowledging what I think are some takeaways that someone might have from this talk, which is that I am somehow, or this research suggests sort of a pro-shame stance. And that is not the case. Rather, the purpose is to expand the perspective on the role of shame in groups by looking at how shame influences sort of norm acquisition, potentially affects norm conformity and socialization. But I also really want to emphasize, and this going back to what Jessica had said before, is that there's a deep effect of shame for the person who experiences it. It is a very painful, potent experience to be the one who has to endure the shame. It comes with a high level of interpsychic strife and interpersonal problems. At the same time, some other people or groups may benefit from this individual's experience of shame by learning from it without having to endure the costs of experiencing it themselves. Now, that said, though, ultimately, whether groups are well served or poorly served by having somebody in the group who experiences shame is a question that would take a better scholar than me to be able to address. However, playing out how one individual's experience of shame affects a group, to me is sort of endlessly fascinating and opens up a lot of different questions about how we think about shame and its role. This is because I said shame is a very potent emotion, and that if the sort of Cooley-Sheff conjecture from 1988 is correct, we are always in a state of either pride or shame. So understanding how those emotions not only affect us, but those around us, to me is what keeps me up at night, is trying to think about that. So thank you so much. And if there is any time for questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Becky. I find that last result of what happens when the person expresses shame really interesting. And it made me think of, what do you think about the comparison between, say, shame and embarrassment in these sort of circumstances? I was looking back during your talk at what Jeffrey Toobin said about his recent indiscretion, and his public statement was that he made an embarrassingly stupid mistake and that he apologizes, which is, to me, is kind of interesting, because that's sort of like a, oh gee, whoops type explanation, but he's not really expressing a lot of contrition. But I'm wondering, you know, how do you think shame and embarrassment are going to function in the same way here? Would you get more of this effect for shame as opposed to embarrassment, let's say?
So I'll talk about the effect of shame versus embarrassment. But the first thing I actually want to say is one of the things that inspired this study was reading the book "So You've Been Publicly Shamed," and one of the conjectures there was that it's possible that the effect of shaming is weaker when you yourself don't experience shame in response to it. So in that case with Tobin, like if he's like, I don't feel shame about this at all, it's totally a normal thing to do, which I disagree with. But if that were the case, then like, would the effect of shaming be more muted? And so I was kind of really curious. Obviously that does not play out in this context, but it was exactly those types of experiences about how people respond to being publicly shamed that sort of inspired this set of studies. And I do think what is interesting is that I think people are reluctant to use the word shame, particularly in certain cultural contexts like the US. And so I think we often communicate it as embarrassment. And I think embarrassment can be related to sort of a moral failing, but it can also be related more to like a social, just like, you know, you could feel embarrassed by tripping on the street in front of people. That's not necessarily a moral failing. It's just sort of a social faux pas. And so I think it's curious that whether if you use embarrassment versus shame, if people see it as less of an infraction or that you believe it to be less of an infraction. I don't know if that's true, but I think it is, if we sort of think about what embarrassment is meant to signal compared to what shame is meant to signal.
Becky, do you think that this result and the high shaming condition with the neutral expression would hold if the person adamantly rejected shaming?
Okay, so I really love that question. In fact, that's actually one of the stories I want to run next, which is just being like, John, shut up. So like, you know, in response to the thing in the chat, like, or if somebody else like calls it out, right? That, so imagine, Jessica, you're the person in the chat and like you're chatting and you're like, this is shameful what you did. And either I say like, just stop it, just shut up. Or like Eric is like, no, Jessica, you're wrong. Like, stop shaming. Then I think, right then I actually feel, you could actually then imagine there that my own expression of shame would probably carry more weight because there's a discounting of your shaming about whether that's signaling the group norm. However, of course, I also think that shaming is going to be more potent than the more people that pile on, right? The more that, like, if everybody in the chat is like saying, yeah, you should be ashamed, it's unconscionable, it's wrong, and everybody agrees, then we'd expect this slope to be even steeper. But I really like the idea about, you know, if you reject it, not just by your emotional experience, which is what I was originally trying to get here, if I reject it by not allowing my own shame expression, but it's possible to sort of turn off that shame, the shaming, that if I have to call it out to say like, I disagree with you trying to say that that's wrong.
I had a related question. I'm curious about the extent to which, if you were to take a context where the injunctive norm was clear, you've always used situations where there isn't a clear injunctive norm and you're trying to see if there's an inference. But if you use a situation where there is an injunctive norm and then people either do or don't experience shame, does that shift people's perception of the injunctive norm? The idea being, we might think that somebody like Trump has like demolished a lot of norms by not seeming to experience shame, that we observe him not experiencing shame And so does that actually shift the norms going forward when people don't experience shame for things we think they otherwise should have?
So I'm like, that's what in some ways I was like, it's weird to say, I actually predicted originally that I wanted this low shaming condition. If you want to say, I wanted it to be like higher, that we would not see that if you, how to put it, that like not showing shame in response to being shamed is positive, because it would be like, oh, it's fine to do that. Like that this is even steeper. Because exactly that point, I think one of the reasons, I don't have any empirical data to suggest this, but like in a context where we have disagreement about what should or should not be appropriate behavior, then you could imagine refusing to show shame in response to a behavior that people have originally thought was injunctive could change it, right? And that's one of the things that people say, like, I won't feel shame, instead I'm going to feel pride about potentially a devalued social identity. Like claiming that as something not to feel shame about, but pride about is something that can then potentially change the injunctive norm, or how we think about that being, is that a moral behavior or not? And so it's almost like using the expression of shame sort of conforms to that norm and says I accept it, and particularly the refusal of it suggests I reject that norm, potentially changing the way that other people believe whether that is appropriate or inappropriate behavior. And I think that is at time. So I just want to again thank you guys, thank everybody for all of the time and being willing to sort of talk about shame and all of the different insights.
And thank you, Becky. That was really great. And thanks to all of the panelists for being here, and for all of our audience members for coming. We have lots of great Q&A that have come in that we'll get to Becky. And assuming that we get the technology together, we will also post the video on YouTube in the near future for you to savor going forward. So thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. We'll see you again soon.